Well, welcome to all of you, faithful trustees, faculty members, our treasured students who are here from all over for this symposium week. It's good to have you all in the house. You're so much taller in person than on Zoom. Wonderful to have you here. Tonight we have the distinct pleasure of having Dr. Ellen T. Armour of Vanderbilt University. You can read of her on the back of the program, but I'd like to say just a personal word or two. Now you're going to hear the Queen's English spoken appropriately tonight. You know, melodious Southern accent, so get ready. Beauty, music to my ears. I have known Ellen for a number of years. In fact, I knew her father. Her father was that'll date me. Her father was a professor at Mercer University and was the head of the National Association of Baptist Professors of Religion. We were the radical ones among the Baptists, and her father, rabble-rouser of them all. A wonderful heritage. He was a professor at Mercer. Ellen has had a distinguished academic career, taught at Rhodes for 15 years, and now has been at Vanderbilt for the last 21 years, and is leading, as you can read, the Carpenter Center there. Phenomenal advocate for LGBTQ issues, justice in the church, and the open and affirming network. I kept trying to introduce her to people tonight. She already knew them, or they knew her. And so I thought, I'm just giving up on this. And so the mother of all networkers is here in our midst. We're so grateful that you're here, and we look forward to hearing what is intriguing to Ellen in these days. It's an honor to have you here, and we listen to you gladly. Welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Molly and her colleagues here at United Theological Seminary for the invitation to give this distinguished lecture. It's quite an honor. I also want to acknowledge all of the hard and fine and meaningful work that so many of you in this room have been doing here in Minneapolis. When I said yes to this lecture, I had no idea I would be coming to the center of something that is also another issue that is also so divisive in our culture and in our country. But I feel like there's actually a good bit of good news coming out of that. I'll say a little bit about that as I go through here. And that is due to the amazing work that so many of you have been doing here in Minneapolis. And I want to acknowledge that and express my gratitude for it. Talk about Christian witness. There you go. Well, among the many issues dividing Americans these days is the conflict over how we should see, understand, and treat people whose gender identities break with norms, or at least appear to. Central to this conflict is how we see gender, understood intersectionally, of course, which reflects how we think we understand gender, also understood intersectionally, of course. This is a conflict where religion, gender, culture, and politics come together. And that's familiar terrain for feminist theology from its inception. I mention feminist theology because that is technically my home discipline. Those of you, come on, move. Those of you familiar with the history of feminism in the U.S. in particular know that we speak of it occurring in two waves. The first wave, which took place in the 19th century, and you can see kind of, an iconic image of that first wave, and the second in the 20th century. You're also likely aware that both waves, despite their roots in the movement to abolish slavery in the case of the first wave, and in the modern civil rights movement, in the case of the second, really struggled with race. Both waves were built around resisting what came to be called the cult of true womanhood. Now, the cult of true womanhood is about really basically a pedestal upon which certain women were placed. And it was basically the demand that women be pretty, pious, and pure, confine themselves to the private realm, and leave the public realm to men. It's not a coincidence, though, that this pedestal and this image of the pedestal features a white woman, because it was only white women who were allowed access to that pedestal. We can think about, for example, the famous speech given by Sojourner Truth, who was a participant in the first wave of the feminist movement, and who, when challenged with whether or not she belonged in such a movement, basically said, "Ain't I a woman? And here are the things that I've been through as someone who lived through slavery and came out the other side." And lest we think, that this is only something that happened in the, let me go ahead and stick with the 19th century for a second. Because we also need to acknowledge one of the founding figures of the first wave of feminism, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, with the passage of the 15th Amendment, which granted black men the right to vote, said that that amendment placed white women, quote, under the heels of the lowest order of manhood. Yikes, indeed. Unless we think that everything changed in the second wave, and this is an example again of the political dimension of it, I don't know how many of you all were familiar with the Moynihan Report, which came out in, I think it was 1969. This was a report that was an analysis of basically what was going on with the black family, and it was an analysis that was very critical of the fact that black men and women were married at a much lower rate than white people were, that most children, black children, were being raised by black women, by single mothers, et cetera, et cetera. And what's perhaps not surprising but disturbing about this report, among many things, is the way it relied on basically blaming black women for this. And it did it by basically drawing on stereotypes of black women that had been present since slavery. That black women were sexually promiscuous intentionally, right? That was their nature. So the figure of the Jezebel, and the fact that it's biblical is not a coincidence either. And those who weren't sexually promiscuous were basically asexual, right? Black women who were supposed to be mammy figures, whose job was to raise mostly white children and not be sexually active. And both of those stereotypes played into what in the 60s and 70s we called the welfare queen, who was, milking the system for all it's worth in terms of money for their own gain, right? It's an awful, awful report. Well, lest we think that somehow feminism and feminist theology was immune from that, it really wasn't. I'm showing you here two books. First, The Church and the Second Sex by Mary Daly, one of the very first feminist theologians to write about feminist theology. And also Sisters of the Wilderness, the very first book in womanist theology. Not coincidentally, probably, these books appear about 10 years apart almost. I think it's 1998 for Daly's book, and earlier than that, 1986 for Daly's book, and 1997, I believe, for Sisters in the Wilderness. But the very fact that we had to have womanist theology, right, is itself endemic to how all of this showed up, racism, et cetera, showed up in feminist theology, or what I called in my first book, white feminist theology, no space, no hyphen, just white feminist theology. Okay, well, that's what we can talk about in terms of race, but what about non-normative sexualities and or gender identity? In its early days, second wave feminism, feminists, including feminist theologians in most cases, understood sex and gender and sexuality kind of this way, that sex was basically the biological markers, the body, and however complicated a way you want, not complicated, but multi-layered a way you want to think about it. They were mostly thinking about it in terms of anatomy. And that, they understood, was something that could not change, right? That was fixed. Gender, on the other hand, was a cultural construction built around that body. And that could change and did change. There was a lot of evidence, in fact, that different cultures understood gender differently and practiced gender differently. Sexuality, they understood to be about who we desire and who we love, but it wasn't really quite thought about in nearly as articulate a way as sex and gender were. But basically, if you were lesbian, you were still a woman. That was not, from a feminist perspective. But transgender, transsexual, that gets a little bit more complicated, as we'll see in a minute. There were, in fact, so-called, what came to be called radical feminists, who were a group that included Mary Daly, she came to identify that way, who said loud and clearly, no, trans women were not women. And in fact, she described trans women as, quote, Frankensteinian monsters. Not kidding. And this in gynecology in this very book. She had a PhD student. You might remember that Daly was actually trained as a philosopher, and that was what her PhD was in. One of her PhD students, Janice Raymond, you might remember that name, who in her dissertation, which became this book, The Transsexual Empire, accused trans women of being, quote, agents of the patriarchy infiltrating women's space. Yeah. That doesn't mean, though, that theologians were not doing some very creative work, right? I taught just recently, the last time I taught queer theology, Carter Hayward's fabulous book, right? Touching Our Strength, The Erotic as Power and Love of God. And this book is deeply intersectional. She's talking about economics, she's talking about race, she's talking about everything. I mean, it's really so timely. So if you haven't read it in a while, or haven't ever read it, I highly recommend you go back and read it. But nothing really about non-normative genders, about trans people, about trans women, anything like that. So, that said, there have been a lot of advances since then. And the very first book, I think, in trans theology came out in 2007. Some of you may have read it, Omnigender, A Trans Religious Approach. Virginia Ramey Mollenkott, who first made her claim to fame as a biblical scholar, wrote this book. And Virginia came out herself as a trans person. So we were, in some ways, I think you might say, maybe not leading the way, but there actually are some really good hopeful notes and encouraging notes in this history of feminist theology when it comes to dealing with transgender nonconformity, I guess might be a way to put it. A key turning point in feminism, more broadly, was the publication of this book called Gender Trouble, authored by Judith Butler, who is a professor now, I don't know if she's retired or not, but anyway, or they are retired. They now use they pronouns. At the University of California, Berkeley. And this book really made a huge impact because of the way that it messed with common perceptions of sex and gender and sexuality. I like to say this is kind of how, Jane and John Doe sort of understand how these things work, probably still today. That basically sex, you're assigned male or female at birth. Think about it. Out comes the baby, and what's the first thing the doctor says? It's a boy. It's a girl. And they expect then that you will identify as male and act masculine and be attracted to women and be in relationships with women, right, if you're identified as male. Same thing if you're assigned female at birth. You will identify as female, you'll act feminine, you'll be attracted to and be in relationships with men. And both follow each other like the night the day. Now, of course, one thing, and this is part of what prompted gender trouble, is as soon as something happens, particularly with that third category, right? When you have somebody who identifies as lesbian or as a gay man and is attracted to someone of the same sex, and it's like, wait a minute, what does that do to, right? And we have stereotypes, right, in our culture at least, that gay men are effeminate and lesbians are masculine, more masculine, right? So you can see how that goes. Well, one of the great insights from Judith Butler's work, Gender Trouble, is that gender can't really sustain this. That basically we assume that gender is based on sex, and we ask that sexual markers serve as the guarantee and the guarantor of gender, right? And they simply are not up to it. Our bodies are just more complicated than that. Think about the variety of intersex conditions, for example, right? And so that was a great insight that really messed with how we think about gender and how we think about sexuality and how we think about non-normative gender identities as well. And it was a real game changer for feminist thinking, including in theology. So a couple of books that I want to just highlight that take up the topic of sexuality and gender identity in a much more complicated and fruitful way. One is Kelly Brown Douglas's Sexuality in the Black Church, which came out in response to the AIDS crisis, which I think is another important cultural moment to take note of when it comes to how these normative ways of thinking about sex, gender, and sexuality. And then also, much more recently, Patrick Cheng's, the very fact that we have an introduction to queer theology, an introduction, that means there's queer theology out there, right, that needs to be introduced in some way. And Patrick, if you all aren't familiar with him, is a gay man who is an Episcopalian priest and has a PhD too in theology and writes deliberately for a more public audience. So I'm putting this out there too just to make you aware of a number of texts that are out there. And there are many more I could cite. I have recently taught, I'm not going to be able to come up with a title, but a couple of really good memoirs by trans women of color who are clergy and who talk about their process of coming into themselves and the religious and theological dimensions of that. And I would strongly recommend those to you as well. Okay, we also have now, fruitfully enough, a new diagram. And this is a relatively older version of it, but I don't think it's changed that much. This is the genderbread person, and let's notice how it works. It distinguishes between identity, attraction, sex, expression, and it places all of them on a continuum. So instead of strict binary systems, you're either one way or the other, you're either male or female, you're either masculine or feminine, you're either gay or straight. It's a much more complicated. Okay, that's where we've been. That's a lot of progress. And yet, look where we are right now. We are witnessing an assault on LGBTQI plus persons and their rights at the federal level and at the state level. Don't get me started talking about the state of Tennessee, where there's just so many horrible things happening every day. It's just rough. And a lot of it is motivated by religious bias, especially Christian bias. Yes, Christian, quote unquote. And that kind of anti-LGBTQIA plus perspective is, I would argue, a key feature, in fact, of white Christian nationalism, right? Which is such a big feature of our time right now. So if what we want to do then, I'm going to say a little bit more about what this means then for seeing gender otherwise. We live in interesting times to say the least. Ours is a time and a place, as you here in Minnesota and Minneapolis in particular know all too well, where so many of the values that we hold dear and the institutions created to safeguard those values are under existential threat. A time of deep political division that has fed distrust in those institutions and in one another. It's a time when it seems like so much of the progress we've made in the modern era, and more recently, is seemingly being undone, at least when it comes to federal support for it and public displays of it. Think pride flags, tableaus and exhibits of Black people's heroism, and so on and so forth. The line between the religious and the secular, between church and state, to be specific, is, if anything, becoming blurrier and blurrier, thanks to white Christian nationalism's hold over people currently in power. But none of this is happening without resistance. A lot of it very strong and very public, and often religiously motivated. Minneapolis, you exemplify this. And that resistance is fed by resources created by those very progressive movements. The modern civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the so-called gay rights movement, and so on. And by folks motivated by their faith, who refuse to cede Christianity to the kind of Christianity that those in power endorse. That doesn't mean, of course, that we harbor any illusions about Christianity's racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, etc. past, or about the degree of even mainline Christians' alignment with, I would say, our politics in the present. We know it's complicated. We know it's a struggle. We know it's tough. But what I want to do with you today is dig a bit deeper into the challenges and opportunities we face when it comes to how we see, especially non-normative gender, intersectionally. And to do that, I'm going to draw primarily on my most recent book, the one Seeing and Believing, which, per the subtitle, is about religion, digital visual culture, and social justice. It is a sequel of sorts to my previous book, Signs and Wonders, Theology After Modernity. It's in Signs and Wonders that I first take a turn toward photography, and I was motivated by certain social justice issues of the time, starting with the photos, the torture archive, as it's called, from Abu Ghraib, among others. But before I get into that, I want to frame what I'm going to say using the work of another scholar, Donovan Schaefer. In his 2022 book, Wild Experiment, Feeling Science and Secularism After Darwin, Schaefer takes on what has become a bedrock presupposition of modernity, that knowing and feeling are and should be polar opposites. Religion, aligned with feeling, is sidelined in favor of secularism, aligned, since Schleiermacher, with knowing. Schaefer pushes back by limiting the intimate connections between knowing and feeling and their positive and negative impacts. He observes, for example, that we wouldn't pursue knowledge, scientific, historical, whatever, were it not for the pleasure that that pursuit brings. Conspiracy theories wouldn't attract believers were it not for the way they attach feeling to that pseudo-knowledge. So Schaefer's cogency theory is an account of the resulting, quote, agonism of compulsions in our bodies, the traces of the rambunctious passion for reason messing together with the sticky affects that surround it to make weird conglomerates of belief. Cogency theory, in short, affirms that thinking and feeling are not just intertwined, they're a single, sprawling, synchronized ballet of faculties. That's a lot. I find Schaeffer's account of cogency theory helpful in setting up what I want to take you through tonight. Coming to see gender otherwise requires leaning into how feeling, scientific knowing, feeling along with religion, especially Christianity in this case, and the secular, come together for good and ill, specifically around how we've been formed to see trans folks, or those we perceive as trans. In recent years, gender-affirming care for trans people has been weaponized for political gain, successfully in the 2024 presidential campaign. And to be clear, the conspiracy theories that fund transphobia are a direct attack on medical science. But they mobilize strong feelings against trans people in no small part because of the disruption that trans folks' very existence seems to pose to our culture's normative binary system, that one I just laid out for you earlier about sex, gender, and sexuality. And that binary system is one that includes not only gender and sex, but race. Not coincidentally, given that system, recent statistics collected by the Human Rights Campaign in 2024 show that Black trans women make up 61% of gender nonconforming people who've been murdered since 2013. Notably, Christians who believe this binary system of sex and gender in particular was divinely ordained from creation seem particularly vulnerable to conspiracy theories. The truth is, however, that this system, what the philosopher Michel Foucault, I'm not going to give you too much about Foucault, don't panic, would call, or does call, a dispositif. And I like that term, dispositif, and I want to define it for you because I think it really speaks to what we're up against, I guess. It's an apparatus that disposes, puts in place various entities, systems, people, etc., to serve modern, what we're going to learn in a minute, is bio-disciplinary power, to serve that version of power's goals, okay, a dispositif. This system, this dispositif, is a modern invention, the product of a mix of science and secularized religion. The very fact that we understand sexuality is so integral to who we are, right, and gender is so integral to who we are, is a product of that very system. And think of the role confession plays in that system, right, especially for those of us who have been through being non-normative, right, and have come out in some way. So, again, we've all been formed by this system. We've all learned certain ways of knowing and feeling and doing and therefore being. And like I say, those of us who come out as LGBTQIA+ are more aware of that formation. I, for example, often mention, I'm lesbian, by the way. Hi, nice to meet you. I talk about learning in my childhood, my parents correcting me for how I walked, because I walked too much like a boy. So I quit doing that. You can tell I don't do it, well, maybe you can't, but I don't think I do that anymore. Anyway, so my focus here, though, is on the relationship between this system, this dispositif, and transphobia. That is, how people perceived as gender divergent, whether they identify as trans or not, are seen and therefore treated, particularly when they present as women of color. A version of transphobia dubbed appropriately trans-misogynoir. My French wants to kick in, right? Misogyny, trans, and noir, right, black. Later, I'm going to invite you to look with me at two photographs that are accessible online, so you can go back and look at them later if you want, that aim to disrupt the normative ways of seeing that inform trans-misogynoir. I turn to photographs because of photography's intimate connection to this modern dispositif. As I argue in Signs and Wonders, photography, light writing, etymologically speaking, helped to establish and continues to maintain and sustain the modern system of race, gender, and sexuality. Photography is, I will show, a cogent practice, if you will, one informed by knowing and feeling, and by a surface secularity that masks a religious residue. Reclaiming that religious residue can, I'm going to argue, disrupt transphobic ways of seeing because of photography's relationship to the confluence of science and secularized religion, of knowing and feeling. In other words, cogency theory in practice that connects photography to our modern dispositif. That was a lot, but it'll get clearer, I promise, as I go. So let me set the stage. This is going to be the nerdiest part of the talk. Be prepared. Bio-disciplinary power and photography, but it'll also have a fun moment or two, I promise. So according to Foucault, modern knowing, doing, being, and feeling channel two forms of power and knowledge that emerge in modernity. They're called biopower and disciplinary power. Because they pretty much work in tandem, you'll see I say bio-disciplinary power most of the time. Channeled through institutions like workplaces and prisons, clinics and asylums, families and schools, disciplinary power seeks to form us into docile subjects, productive workers, repentant prisoners, good boys and girls, nurturing mothers and masterful fathers. This is my family when I was in my first year of college. You see my youngest brother over here not being exactly a good boy, right? But my parents were indeed very good, nurturing parents. And ultimately, to create normal men and women. There's my youngest brother at his wedding, looking perfectly, right, normal, all the good stuff. I took the picture, so I'm not in it. Not that I'm normal, but anyway. Normal-ish, yeah. So if disciplinary power yields what Foucault calls an anatomopolitics of the human body, biopower yields a biopolitics of the human race. Biopower nurtures the lives of certain of its subjects while allowing others to die. I'm using a photograph from an AIDS protest as an example, right? That was indeed some of the responses to AIDS in the beginning, right? Where it's a plague against gay men, let them die. That would be an example of biopower. In the name of the people, it works on and through us as individuals, aided and abetted by disciplinary power. But its ultimate targets are populations. Its ultimate aim, the survival and flourishing of the human species. In aim and effect, I argue, following philosopher Liddell McWhorter, this fabulous book, Racism and Sexual Oppression in Anglo-America, A Genealogy, biopower is both positively and negatively racist. By positively, I mean it nurtures the life of the human race by eliminating the abnormal, mostly through malign neglect, allowing nature to take its supposed course, or, on occasion, active interventions. And while abnormals are to be found throughout the human race, they have an uncanny knack for showing up in larger numbers in certain populations, colonized or enslaved peoples and their descendants, for example. Think about the Moynihan Report. Thus, these populations feel biodisciplinary power's most virulent and violent effects, often in concentrated form. That said, we all live out our lives, individually and collectively, by conforming to, or sometimes resisting, biodisciplinary power's normative demands. Again, most, if not all of us, however we identify, continue to seek the truth that submitting to biodiscipline offers us, a truth that holds out the promise of a secure identity and a communal home. We continue to give ourselves over, often without question, to the taxonomy of identities spawned by biodisciplinary power. Understandably, we need the goods, economic, social, medical, and so on, that this dispositif runs on and generates. But power also spawns resistance. The various social movements of the modern era embody that. And resistance can take many forms, especially in a dispositif where power runs not simply from the top down, but really through a complex asymmetrical network that incorporates, pun intended, all of us. We are all individually nodes of bio-disciplinary power. We can do something with that power. We can conform, for sure, but we can also resist. The expansion of the taxonomy of sexual and gender identities in recent years, and particularly with the support of modern science, right, these days, simultaneously resists and torques this dispositif. Gender-affirming care is a potent reminder of how much we rely on the goods and services, if you will, that this dispositif has produced. Okay, that's the nerdy part. Okay, maybe a little bit more. Anyway, that background sets the stage for my turn to photography as a resource for countering transphobia, transmisogynoir. As I argue in Signs and Wonders, embedded in and enabling modern ways of knowing and feeling, being and doing, is also a new way of seeing, what Martin Jay calls a new scopic regime, and a new form of visual subjectivity, dubbed by Jonathan Crary, the observer. Now, you don't need to know the details of how all that works, but just the overview. Emergent human sciences and new visual technologies, including photography, were largely responsible for this shift. And photography, I argue, continues to entrain us in modern modes of seeing, knowing, doing, and being. To pose for, shoot, or simply glance at a photograph of ourselves or of others, whether we know those others or not, is one among many ways that we subject ourselves to biodisciplinary power, in this case, channeled through the camera's lens. Photography's relationship to biodisciplinary power is certainly about seeing as and knowing, but it is also about feeling. And feeling and knowing are intrinsic to believing. As an everyday practice, not specifically, or not necessarily specifically, a religious one. As I first argued in Signs and Wonders, scholars of photography distinguish between what photographs index, what I call the that, then, there, that they reference, that often prompted a photographer to take the picture in the first place, and what they open onto. Though we now take it for granted, photography's claim to simply represent the photographed object, which is what I call photographic truth, was established by photography's use as an instrument of biodisciplinary power. And in turn, photography was essential to realizing biodisciplinary power's drive toward normalization. But what we believe we see in a photograph is also a matter of what I call photographic affect. That is, how photographs move us emotionally and sometimes to take action. The same photograph can move us in very different ways, a dynamic I call photographic ambivalence. Think, for example, of the role photography has played here in Minneapolis. Our videos of ICE killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, evidence of murder or of officers defending themselves? Complicated, not a complicated question, but still. But whether we can believe what we see in a given photograph has been a question since the camera's invention. I presume, though, that I don't have to convince you that the stakes of our affective, and evidentiary investments in photographs are particularly high these days, thanks to the advent of the cell phone camera and social media. And that's the focus of seeing and believing. What I do in that book is basically update what I talked about in Signs and Wonders in order to take account of this dramatic shift and how and who we are and how and who we relate to photographically. That reality reflects both how deeply intertwined our real lives have become with what we've come to call our virtual lives, and how easy it is to manipulate digital photographs. Remember, I talked about photographs as light writing. That's the etymology, photography, right? Well, it turns out now digital photographs don't even need an object to be generated. They don't need light. You can generate a digital photograph out of whole cloth, whole digital cloth, binary code. Should we even call them photographs at all? Well, thus far, what I've done is describe what I call in Signs and Wonders photographic subjection. That is, the role that photography plays in biodisciplining us. However, my ultimate goal is to jumpstart what I call in Seeing and Believing photographic insurrection. Rather than docile acquiescence to the demands of biodisciplinary power, might we cultivate the ability to see through biodisciplined photographic normativity and what it would have us believe about ourselves, others, and the world we share? And how might the religious residue still present in biodisciplined seeing advance this goal? We speak of certain photographs as iconic, as able to stand in for the events they reference, because, as communications scholars Robert Harriman and John Lewis Lukacs argue, they capture what's at stake in those events with remarkable pathos and power. How many of you recognize this photo? Yep. You may not know the name of it. It's taken by Dorothea Lange. It's called Migrant Mother. And it was taken during the Depression. This photograph has been credited with generating support for the New Deal. How many of you know this photograph? Okay, yeah, from the Vietnam War, right? Nick Utt's Napalm Girl, which is credited with accelerating opposition to the Vietnam War. These are iconic photographs. Iconic photographs, I argue, are what philosopher John Protevi calls circuits of political affect that arise out of situations of social conflict or crisis. I mentioned the work of Harriman and Lukacs. Here it is. Note the title of their book, No Caption Needed. Perfect, isn't it? As they argue in their aptly titled book, by, quote, concentrating and directing emotions, iconic photographs serve as, quote, aesthetic resources for the performative mediation of conflicts. That we speak of iconic photographs at all is an example of the religious residue, hidden sometimes in plain sight in the secular, a residue centered around belief. Long before the invention of the camera, and well before the Reformation divided Catholicism from Protestantism, a controversy over icons split the Western Church from the Eastern Church. Were visual images of Christ and of Christian saints windows onto the divine, and thus worthy of veneration? Or were they its misrepresentations? Were they icons or idols, in other words? Okay, querying how we see. Tonight I want to invite you to look with me at two photographs. One analog, that is the old-fashioned, big old camera. One digital. One with no explicit religious reference. One with. Both are carefully and deliberately crafted by professional photographers to disrupt normative seeing, and both feature trans people of color, a particularly appropriate move given the heightened risk of violence trans women of color face, as I noted earlier. They are intended to be, quote, aesthetic resources for the performative mediation of conflicts. Intended to be. It's one reason I'm interested in artistic photography, or art photography. What impact might these photos have? Now, there is no iconic photo of a trans person so far as I'm aware, and I'm not trying to generate one. That's above my pay grade. Still, it might seem like I'm stacking the deck, and perhaps I am, but intentions don't necessarily achieve their goals, especially given photographic ambiguity. So go with me into this experiment and see what you think. The first photograph is featured on the cover as well as inside of the 2016 photo book On Christopher Street, Transgender Stories, by the photojournalist Mike Seliger. The photo book contains photographs Seliger shot over 3 summers on New York's Christopher Street in a community known for its gender and sexual diversity. Most of the photographs, including this one's internal version, as you'll see in a minute, are accompanied by brief comments from the photographed subjects, some of whom reference their own encounters with violence and violation. Iconic photos may not need captions, but maybe art photographs often do. The second is from a digital art exhibit of photos featuring a diverse range of LGBTQIA+ actors posed in postures that reference iconic paintings of Jesus. This art exhibit accompanies the 2022 prize-winning documentary, Wonderfully Made, LGBTQIA+R Religion. I don't know how many of you have seen this film. I don't know if we didn't premiere it, but we ran it at Vanderbilt in a joint thing between the Carpenter program and the Vanderbilt Art Gallery, and a local organization focused on care for Catholic kids and Catholic queer kids. And it was an amazing experience to actually see the art exhibit as well as the film. It's really amazing. I'm going to attend to both the photos and their contexts, where they appear, and at least in the first case, the extended caption, if you will, that accompanies it. To prompt your own reflections on what the photographs and their contexts open up and onto, I will share some of my reactions to these photographs. Okay, first, on Christopher Street. Like all of Seliger's photographs in the book, this one is black and white, not color. Due to photographic convention, black and white photos code as more documentary than color photos do, prompting us to believe its claim to a specific that, then, there, an actual couple in an actual place at a specific day and time. That claim is bolstered by the context that accompanies it inside the book. There we see the couple's names, Jamel Young and Leomi Maldonado, and a brief quotation from Jamel that frames the way we're encouraged to look at them. Quote, "She's a trans woman and I'm a trans man, so it actually makes this completely normal. I'm a man and she's a woman, and that's just as simple as it is," unquote. Jamel and Leomi look straight at us, unsmiling, as if daring us to deny the truth of what they believe they embody. But will we see their truth? The way they're posed invites and dares us to look, to scan their bodies, looking for signs of abnormality. Jamel certainly codes masculine in shape, dress, and pose, and Leomi feminine. That Leomi is taller than Jamel troubles gender norms a bit, but she's leaning on him, and he's supporting her, which reaffirms them. Absent the context, would we know that they were trans? Maybe that's an example of photographic ambiguity. But there's more. Something about the photo, its color tone, the way they hold their bodies and each other, projects their hard-earned claim to be recognized for who they are and how they have come to be who they are, and the risks they endure every day. Wonderfully Made. This color this time, photograph's claim to a that, there, then is complicated, given the artwork it appears to reference. A Currier and Ives lithograph of Jesus Christ from the early 20th century Whether the actor in the photo is trans or not is impossible to say, but we know from its context that she identifies as LGBTQIA+. And I'm saying she, and we know from the context because one of the things that the documentary, I think it may talk about, but at least the producers talked about, filmmakers talked about, is they were very careful and deliberate in interviewing and identifying actors from California who were identified as LGBTQIA+ in some way, but who were also people of color. And they wanted to be sure that they used folks who were part of this community to create this exhibit, this art exhibit. So that this Christ, I'm going to call her Krista, presents as female and a female of color rather than a white male disrupts centuries-old artistic convention present in fine art and popular art. I don't know how many of you remember the artwork, that maybe it's that Currier and Ives piece that my grandmother at least had in her dining room, right, of the white Jesus, right, looking up like this. Seeing Krista sparks and amplifies photographic affect. No doubt some viewers will be repelled by the photo and find it idolatrous, but others will be, as I am, moved by it in complicated ways. The photo literally clothes Krista in the complexities of Christ's crucifixion, what Christian orthodoxy deems a voluntary, vicarious sacrifice is also an act of state violence. Like Jamel and Laomi, Krista stands straight and tall, her body facing forward, a posture that signals courage and vulnerability simultaneously. Rather than looking straight out at us, Krista looks past and a bit above us, as if seeking support from above. The light behind her, in the colors of the iconic Pride rainbow, flows down from above, suggesting she has support, a suggestion confirmed by the barely visible words, "wonderfully made," that flow diagonally across the photo. Will we align with Krista and God and affirm that she is wonderfully made? Or will we align ourselves with the contemporary analogs of those who chanted, "Crucify him, crucify him"? So what then do these photographs contribute to photographic insurrection? Both contest transphobia and transmisogynoir, first and foremost, by giving it photographic representation, and in a way, I think, that honors trans resilience. Both call viewers to wrestle with what we believe we see in the photos, including our own compliance with normative seeing and its often violent reinforcement. But what does tapping into religious seeing via explicitly referencing religious imagery add? Wrapping that potential violence and resistance to it in Christological imagery seeks to sanctify that call, a goal amplified by the photo's context. By documenting Christianity's role in LGBTQIA+ injustice, Wonderfully Made seeks to move viewers to be better and do better. That may be an important difference between photography that actually uses explicitly religious imagery and photography that doesn't. But imagine seeing both of these together, what that might do. So let me close by offering a few final thoughts on theology as a visual practice, the title of this lecture. First of all, and just to clarify, I turn to these art photographs not because they somehow escape our modern dispositif, but because of how they engage with it. Like all forms of photography on my read, art photography necessarily channels bio-disciplinary power. However, like the taxonomic expansion referenced in the acronym, ever-growing acronym, LGBTQIA+, these photographs push back on biodisciplinary power by working with and against it simultaneously. Framing art photography through cogency theory helps explain this. Like science or history, art photography is a discipline, in the Foucauldian sense too, but one explicitly rooted in bringing knowing and feeling together to prompt viewers to feel and know and see differently. The photographs artists produce can not only catch our eye, but make it difficult to just glance and look away. That can sometimes inspire viewers to slow down and really look. And when they do that, viewers may move into what Schaeffer calls the persuasion zone. To enter that space is to explore the way, quote, tense knots of power, desire, knowledge, and history pull on our bodies and how they're worked by people, places, and things around us, by relationships and antipathies, by hopes and frustrations, by memory and pain, exhilaration and shame, bliss and rage, unquote. No easy task, and no guarantees that those of us who enter that space will be persuaded. But these photos have the potential to change hearts and minds. That said, focusing this experiment on art photographs may seem elitist, old-fashioned, and out of step with the real world. While some of us do occasionally go to formal art exhibits in museums or galleries, most of us engage with photographs, amateur photographs primarily, on the various social media platforms that, as I discuss in Seeing and Believing, constitute our new public square. We call it a public square. Let's remember, it's owned by people. But anyway, some of those photographs invite us into the persuasion zone, often because they prompt strong emotional reactions. But the draw of what's next disincentivizes spending the kind of time and energy in the persuasion zone that could disrupt biodiscipline seeing. That's no accident. Social media platforms may function like public squares, but all of them are privately owned. Together, they constitute and run on what's called an attention economy. They make money by attracting, that is, capturing our attention, often through visual images. Think photographs, memes, GIFs, etc. A lot of people describe social media as visually saturated for that reason. They incentivize us to glance and quickly move on to the next and the next. They don't make as much money if we just stick with one thing. They make it when we keep looking, keep scrolling, keep checking something else out. Thus, making the most of the opportunities to stay in the persuasion zones that we occasionally stumble into on social media will likely require us to slow down and really look, something I call in Seeing and Believing photographic ascesis. Think about asceticism. These photographers mobilize the camera with the goal of moving us to see their subjects, Jamel, Leomi, Krista, differently. They invite us to slow down and look, to not only enter, but stay within the persuasion zone. If we accept that invitation, perhaps we'll stay long enough to challenge and change what we believe we see in the photograph and in our world and in ourselves, including our own formation by biodisciplinary power. Looking more deeply into how these photographs move us emotionally and perhaps to take action can, literally and figuratively, open our eyes to what might otherwise remain unseen, each other in our full complexity. The cracks in normative seeing might make space for an alternative attention economy, if you will. One that, rather than flipping to the next visual object and the next, slows down and looks. One that leads us in the direction of acknowledging mystery rather than seeking mastery. There you go.
Will you take questions now?
Absolutely. I was about
Right.
to say, happy to take any questions.
And we'll also monitor the Zoom for those joining us on Zoom, but take questions here or online.
Hello, I'm Sean. I am a MA student at United. How do you see AI-generated imagery kind of contributing to bio-disciplinary power? And how do you see that imagery interacting with photographic insurrection and disrupting it potentially?
That's a great question. AI, well, I'll start by situating AI basically and just kind of how I think about technology in general, particularly when it comes to social media and, all the previous digital cameras, all that stuff. I think it's pretty clear that these are all really deeply human technologies. And because they're deeply human technologies, they're going to bear within them the best and the worst of us, right? And that's as true of AI as it is of any of these other technologies. Of course, it's on hyperdrive when it comes to AI, and what AI is going to turn into, this is going to, I listened to a podcast the other day. No, it wasn't a podcast. It was an episode on NPR, talking with Michael Pollan, who he is, a famous author, on this topic. And one of the things that he observed is basically in line with mine, that that it's hard to know, can we talk about AI as sentient at this point? Can we talk about it as human in some way, shape, or form? And sentient he was kind of okay with in a certain sense, because sentient just means, everything's sentient. Trees are sentient, right? Animals are sentient. Bacteria are sentient. But that's a whole different level than kind of this sort of consciousness kind of thing. That distinction is an important one. And I think the other issue with AI is if it, if anything, amplifies all the questions around photographic truth, right? It's not only can photographs be generated, right, digital photographs be generated out of whole digital cloth, but by something that had absolutely no relationship to whatever that is going on. So I think basically my answer to your question, insofar as I have one, is it just makes it that much worse, but also maybe that much better, right? It's going to be the same thing. Whatever images we encounter are going to provide us with the opportunity to look more deeply, to think more deeply, to think critically, to look critically, but also maybe to, potentially change our minds about things. But I really hope, and this is one reason I'm kind of turning more toward analog photography, back to analog photography and to art photography these days, is that human element and the importance of a kind of that then there, that I think is just inescapable. Thank you.
Ellen, with this, thank you so much. With the Epstein files.
Oh, God.
And we have photographs and video, but we'll just stay with photographic truth. And I'm wondering your thoughts on whether it would with ambiguity, help, harm, heal, whatever. Because we're not believing women's stories, survivor stories, or in a broad sense, in terms of our judicial processes and moral clarity or unclarity of our government. And I'm wondering your thoughts on keeping things redacted versus and how we would make decisions about allowing or permitting photographic truth to be revealed, and the dangers that that might also have.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, there's a lot to say there in terms of how complicated and thick that is, right? One of the things, I think, just to go back to Christopher Street for a moment, the importance of context. We talk about iconic photographs, right, and that no caption needed, but those photographs originally had captions, and they came in what were then trusted news sources, right? They weren't just kind of random things. Nick was a photojournalist working for, I can't remember now which paper, but and you knew that you had reliable editors looking at those photographs, deciding what was legit, deciding what could be published and what shouldn't be published, and whether or not that then there was accurate, right? Things are a little bit more complicated with Dorothea Lange, but that was the Works Progress Administration, and she, again, that was what she was charged with, is documenting what's happening out there in the real world. And here we have a case with the Epstein files, right? This is documenting stuff that happened in the real world, right? Nobody, well, that's not quite true. Nobody's contesting that, but that is, Epstein's been convicted of sex crimes. The fact there's evidence beyond a doubt of this, giant network of people who were involved in it. And yet, right? Part of the issue is we have always had this problem with believing women, particularly when it comes to sexual assault. And, I have a former student, for example, who's been working for a long time in the area of supporting victims of survivors of sexual assault, particularly in religious sites and spaces. And that question of belief is what she wrote her dissertation on for exactly this reason. It doesn't help then to have these incredibly powerful men, basically, right, in control of institutions that then have the power to redact. So the play, I think, of what's seen and what's unseen, what's allowed to be seen and what's eliminated from being seen and being read, is really complicated. But it again pushes on this deeper, it reminds us that that photographs and the systems around them really run deep in our culture. And so it's a bigger problem in some ways. It's endemic of bio-disciplinary power, basically, right? And how you're formed and shaped and all of that. How we'll find our way out of it, I don't know. It's an important question. And I worry, too, that the distrust we've come to have in photography already is only going to make this particular situation worse, even though, many of these photographs would predate certainly cell phone photography, if nothing else. But that confluence of not believing women in the first place, not trusting sources of information, and not trusting photography right now is going to make it very difficult. I wish I had an easier answer, but it's going to be tough.
Where are the questions? Where's the chat question? Has a photograph ever made a big significance for you religiously?
Ooh, for me religiously? That's a great question. Yes, in some ways, and this is this is kind of weird. One of the things that religiously, in a certain sense, one of the things that compelled me to write about Abu Ghraib in particular was the use of religious imagery there, and so that image of one of the prisoners of war, right, being positioned like Christ, definitely moved me, I would say, religiously and politically in all kinds of ways. And it was really, that was what got me into writing about photographs in the first place, was I felt like I had an obligation as a Christian, as a theologian, to respond to what was being done in the name of my religious tradition. And so yeah, absolutely, in that sense. And I would say the same thing for the other photographs I talked about in that book, too, but particularly that one, I think, was really huge.
Hi, my name is Melissa Harrell. Thank you very much, Professor Armour. I'm wondering about how our sense of identity and our own appearance in photographs might work. My own sense of identity as a trans person has a spiritual element, but my embodiment complicates that,
Yeah.
as you discuss a bit tonight.
Yeah.
And I also have family members who refuse to be photographed because I think what they see in a photograph, it doesn't line up with who they think they really are or want to be or should be. And I think about the government's use of photographs and things like passports and so on. And I just wonder about that sense of seeing oneself in a photograph.
Yeah.
Is that affirming? Is it disaffirming? Is it troubling? Is it, this is my best angle, that kind of stuff that we do. Oh, let me take my glasses off and you can take a picture.
Yeah.
All that stuff. And some of it's sort of comical, but some of it's very deep. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things, this is not a photograph exactly, but, well, it is a photograph, I guess, that I talk about in Signs and Wonders, is a still from the video that Terry Schiavo's parents took of her. And I talk about the power of family photography, basically, in there. That particular still, on the one hand, is Terry Schiavo didn't probably, as far as we can tell, give her consent to have this video taken of her, much less shared all around the world, right, in the way that it was, and that still to be shared all around the world. And yet it is a moving photograph full of photographic ambiguity. What do you see when you see that photograph? How do you think about the person who is in there in some shape or form when you see that photograph? Whose life is being determined, life or death is being determined by an argument, basically, between her parents and her husband over whether she should be allowed to die. That's a horrible situation to be in. And I think I actually show in the book, I think I have a photograph, that photograph, as well as a photograph of Terry before she had the catastrophic event that led to her diagnosis, to kind of illustrate, this is the same person. And what do we do with that reality? It's really tough. And the way that we can use photographs like that photograph was, both of them were actually, as political footballs, basically, without really acknowledging the humanity of the person whose life and death is at stake. That's true of the Abu Ghraib photographs too. So I think it is one of the most critical issues when it comes to photographs of human beings, for sure. What we see there, what we use those photographs for, is really crucial. There's another book I use called Algorithms of Oppression by Safiya Noble, she talks about and it's basically an analysis of just how deeply racist a lot of our algorithmic language is and practice is. She talks about searching for Black Girl Fun, I think it was, something like that. She was hosting her niece and one of her niece's best friend, and searching that on Google to see, okay, what kind of things would be fun to do? And what came up was all sexual images and sexual stuff. And that's all Google's fault. It's corrected that since then. But again, this is the kind of issue we have to wrestle with all of this, particularly now, these days. It's not just the photographs, it's the context in which we encounter them, it's the context in which they're produced, et cetera. So it's a great question. It's a great question.
Thank you for this wonderful, wonderful talk. I was curious when you're thinking about theology as a visual practice, of your use in the slideshow of showing book covers, and I was particularly struck by the contrast around with Omnigender, with Virginia Mollenkott choosing to use her own image as that cover image, especially since trans authors often have to veto the image of bathroom signs on the covers of the books and so forth. Right. But the contrast between that and Mary Daly and Jan Raymond's book covers. So I just wondered if you might speak a little about your choice to use those covers and how they might reflect theologically on what you're saying.
That's a great question. I wish I'd thought about that before, and I didn't quite. You know, I could say the same thing about the. I mean, I think there's a similar question about the covers of my two books. So for Seeing and Believing, that cover, that's an abstract design that somebody at Columbia University Press came up with, and I was like, oh my God, that's amazing, absolutely amazing. Particularly for, well, I won't go into that, but anyway, it's really amazing. But for Seeing and Believing, I mean, for Signs and Wonders, you know, I talked about 4 different sets of photographs. I've already mentioned the Terry Schiavo ones and Abu Ghraib, but I also talked about the consecration of Gene Robinson as the first openly gay bishop, which made, like, maybe not the front page, but like the second page of major newspapers in town with photographs. That never happens, right? It's never happened before. And I also talk about Hurricane Katrina. That was the 4th thing I talk about. And when Columbia sent me the design they'd come up with for my book, I originally said, I don't use any of these photographs, because how would you pick which one to use? I just can't see it. Well, they send me this one. And I said, well, how'd you pick this one? And they said, well, it was the only one that was kind of happy. I was like, oh, that's hilarious. But I think, you know, the issue of book design, book cover designs is its own thing, of course. And one of the reasons I wanted to use Virginia's book was precisely because it had her photograph on the cover. Their photograph on the cover. And I thought that was, brave, right? Because again, speaking back to the earlier question, here's someone who has come out as trans and, you know, showing themselves, hopefully, as they wish to be seen. And that's going to be a shock to some people who have seen this person in a very different way, right? And the bravery in that, but also the power in that, you know, of the claim that's being asserted there. And I thought that was really important to highlight. Can't think of, I can't off the top of my head, so y'all keep thinking, you're theological scholars, of another book where the author's photograph appears on the front cover as part of the cover. I can't think of one either. And it's really kind of amazing. And in part, I wanted those covers up there mostly, well, for a lot of reasons, because I wanted to give credit to those books, or at least acknowledge these books, particularly the ones that were important for me. But I think the cover of Gynecology is really interesting, right? Because of the weaponry that's there on that front cover, right? Gyne with a slash through it, and ecology. I mean, it's really, if that doesn't say something about Mary Daly and what she was intending with that, I don't know what possibly does, right? So that one in particular, I think, has a kind of potency to it. And same thing with the Church and the Second Sex. I tried really hard to get the original copy of that cover, not just the more recent one that has all the updates and stuff. But that's really crucial. And same thing with this. I obviously don't know Seliger, so I haven't asked, but it's really interesting to me that this is the photograph that he picked for the cover. And one reason I wanted to go with that is just convenience, if nothing else, right? Anybody can look at that. You can go to Amazon and you'll see the cover, the fact that it's on the cover. But also the fact that he chose it as the cover, the fact that I hope, well, all these folks gave their consent, right, to being included in the book. I don't know. I hope he did. As a journalist, I think he would have gotten Jamel and Naomi's consent for it to be on the cover, because that's a bit risky, you know. And that, too, I think is really important for this purpose.
I think we may have time for one more, and we have one online in the queue from John the Tominal.
Hi, John.
Ellen's talk about exegesis strikes me as profoundly important. It is a call for looking as spiritual. It is a call for looking as spiritual practice. But how do we cultivate, one, an awareness that looking requires such practice, and two, the actual discipline of such looking?
Oh, that's a great question, and in some ways it goes, you know, it pushes in some ways sort of against what we're up against because of, right, social media and the attention economy that we are so entrapped in. On the other hand, you know, how often has it happened that some photograph grabs your attention? I talk in Seeing and Believe. Well, let me say, I've said about Signs and Wonders that it deals with 4 specific sets of photographs. I decided not to focus on specific photographs in Seeing and Believing for a couple of reasons. For one thing, getting permission to reprint photographs isn't, man, it's hard. It added a year to the publication date of Signs and Wonders. And anyway, it's complicated. But the other was, I didn't want to just hone in on specific things. I wanted to get to the bigger thing. That said, I did anchor it in what I call the photographic storyline that illustrates photographic ambiguity, I thought, pretty clearly. And it's the photographic storyline that starts with the death of Trayvon Martin, the murder of Trayvon Martin. And you'll remember Trayvon Martin is murdered in Sanford, I think it's Sanford, Florida, by a Latino man who sees this kid, black kid, walking in his mostly white neighborhood wearing a gray hoodie and thinks he shouldn't be there and kills him. Is cleared of murder, you know, all that stuff. Well, that's what kind of launched, in many ways, the Black Lives Matter movement, which began as a hashtag. And you'll remember that photograph, there was no visual imagery at all of the murder or of Trayvon at that time. But there was a selfie of Trayvon that he had taken and posted of himself in that gray hoodie. And it's an amazing photograph, right? And it became iconic. So many people, Barack Obama, on and on, right? Posed themselves in that same photograph. People carried that photograph on signs, right, to Black Lives Matter protests. But that very same photograph prompted Dylan Roof to start diving down to Google black-on-black crime. And that led to him down into this deep rabbit hole that led to his becoming radicalized. And he posted online before he went to Mother Emanuel Church and killed all the people and black people in that church. He published online a manifesto featuring himself sitting by a fire holding a Confederate flag and a gun. And Dylan Roof's actions prompted a guy in New Zealand to do the same thing at a mosque and live stream it on Facebook. And that prompted the Tops murderer, right, at Tops grocery store to go to this grocery store and kill a bunch of black people again. So photographic ambiguity is not just a kind of, you know, it's ambiguous. What do we do with it? But it can have very serious life or death consequences. And hopefully, maybe being aware of what those consequences can be might motivate us to live with those photographs, right? To pause and look, really look at what we see in those photographs and what we can do with them. I didn't talk about this dimension of seeing and believing here, but one of the things I do in that book is I turn to the work of a visual culture scholar named, what did I say his name is? David Morgan, thank you, yes. David Morgan, who's at Duke. And in a book called The Embodied Eye, he lays out these 8 ways of seeing, religious ways of seeing, that he argues that really come naturally to us, phenomenologically speaking, but that we use in certain ways to see religious objects. And they're pretty amazing. And they provide a kind of visual repertoire of gazes, I argue, that we could use, right, and probably are using. In fact, I conducted an experiment. I talk about that in the book with my students in a class where I showed them the picture of Dylan Roof and the selfie of Dylan Roof and also of Trayvon, and asked them to look at whichever one they could and write down what they thought. And then after they'd become literate in all this literature about theology and visual culture, I showed them the photographs again and asked them now to pick a gaze or to see if what they'd said and how they looked at the photograph originally, given what they'd written, suggested they were using one of these gazes. And to a person, they identified a gaze that they were using. Then I asked them to deliberately assume another gaze and see what would happen looking at it that way. And they wrote these most really very moving reflections about how it had changed them. So I mentioned that to say, we've got the potential right here in our bodies, in our eyes, and in our brains, and in our hearts. And in some ways, it's just a part of really following that lure and being willing to look more deeply. And of course, just looking by itself isn't going to do it, but getting ourselves educated, doing whatever we need to do when we follow where these photographs lead us and how they can change us.
I want to add my deep gratitude. I feel like it has been years that I have, as I worked in the pro-LGBTQIA movement, have been the recipient and of your brilliant scholarship. And so just a word of deep personal gratitude. And I wonder if we might just take one more moment to thank Dr. Armour. Thank you. I would invite you to join with me in a word of prayer. Holy One, we know your names are as numerous and varied as your people, to whom you reveal yourself in different ways, so that we might be your co-creative, imaginative lovers in a world abundant with redemptive images. Tonight, as we sit amidst the concrete, palpable, cruel violence of bio-disciplinary power, we call on you, binary-busting, bodacious one. Give us the creativity and kindness to disrupt oppressive normativity, to seek mystery, not mastery, to light right insurrection. As we leave here, sanctify our embodiment and empower our joyful, joyous, expansive living that is worthy of our sacred incarnation. We ask it in your many names. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.